Okay, I'd like to welcome council members, council staff and any members of the public who are online to this information session. I'd also like to acknowledge the land that we gather on tonight is the traditional lands for the Kaurna people, and that we respect their spiritual relationship with their country. We also acknowledge the Kaurna people as the custodians of the Greater Adelaide region, and that their cultural and heritage beliefs are still as important to the living Kaurna people today. This session has been convened for the purpose of briefing council members on the long-term financial plan. This session is for information sharing and not for the purpose of debating issues, building consensus positions or otherwise discharging council's deliberative and decision-making functions. There is no set agenda, no minutes will be taken during this session. Following the presentation, the live stream will be paused as council members will be engaging in an interactive activity that is not suitable for streaming. Thank you.
Sorry, I moved. I just thought it was probably more appropriate that I sit at this end of the table, given that we are live streaming. So thank you everyone for coming out tonight. So as the Mayor mentioned, this session is talking about the long-term financial plan for the next 10 years. I'll say 10 to 12 years. We might actually expand the time frame depending on the discussions that we actually have through the process. As I mentioned in some previous correspondence with you, so we are actually going to have a bit of an interactive session today. So I will provide a bit of an overview, and some of this sort of stuff is that you've, I suppose it's been introduced or mentioned during the budget process, but I just think it's important that we actually continue to reinforce the underlying themes as we actually go through and revisit the long-term financial plan. As you'll see at the back of the room, what we've actually done is, of all the strategic projects document that was provided to you earlier, and hopefully you've all had a chance to have a bit of a read through, we've put them on butcher's papers. And what we'll actually be asking you is to try and prioritise those projects, so then they can actually be overlaid from a financial perspective to work out what other changes that we actually need to do to our financial strategy over the next 10 to 20 years. And while we only have to do a long-term financial plan that covers 10 years, I think some of these projects and some of the things that we're actually talking about and have been talking about in the chamber probably extend beyond that 10-year horizon. So I think it's actually important that we actually potentially build on or somehow incorporate a bit of a longer horizon in this planning process, because there is some quite meaty projects and that have been communicated through the community as well. So it's just managing those expectations from a community perspective. Now this won't work that I'm up here. Point it that way? Okay, so did you just move it? So I'll go through the purpose of the long-term financial plan. A lot of this, again, is just a bit of reinforcing some of what we're trying to do out of this long-term financial planning process. The challenges for council, which we all know, but again, just reinforcing them. What our financial strategy to form the foundation of the long-term financial plan, because the long-term financial plan needs to be more than just numbers. It's what the principles and the foundation and the parameters that we're actually going to apply when it comes to decision making as we go through the years. What our financial goals and outcomes, and obviously then we'll finish up with the strategic project session review. So the purpose, it's a legislative requirement, we all know that. And it has to be reviewed within 2 years of a local government election. So we need to probably have this adopted probably by the November meeting, or it could follow on into the December meeting, because the December meeting's only 2 weeks later, but pretty much we should have it adopted before the end of the financial year. And so what the plan does is sets and guides the delivery of the council's financial strategy, and we should actually be using the plan once it's set and aiding the decisions that we're actually making as we go through the budget cycle and as we actually consider any proposals or business cases or projects that become before the council, in the context of the financial strategy and the plan that we've actually set, to make sure that we're actually delivering the outcomes that we've actually set out in the community plan. So yes, the community plan are quite high-level outcomes, but effectively what we should be doing is making sure that those decisions and the financial resources and the projects are actually linked back to the community plan, and our leading strategy documents. So this is when I refer to leading strategy documents, I'm talking about what our growth framework 2046 is, the integrated asset management plan, the environmental plan, our sport and recreation plan. So I think that we've probably got about 5 or 6 lead strategies under each of our goals, and then we have a whole heap of sub-plans, which form, I suppose, those operational plans that guide our day-to-day delivery of service, but also some of it actually might be major projects that we actually implement to deliver on the community plan or that lead strategy. Once the plan's set, going forward, it should set the foundation for future budgets. So we should actually be making sure that when we actually set a budget, we're actually referencing back to what we've actually sort of told the community, this is what we're planning on doing, this is the planning on, this is how much capital spend and this is how much renewal spend. We don't need to be specific in this plan as to what the individual projects are, but it's that direction of where we're actually going. And that's probably more important now as well as we go into the SCOSA review process, because that is one of the things that they're actually going to look for going forward, is to sit there and say, are you linking back in your annual budget processes, in your asset management planning and your long-term financial planning, are they all linking? And this is what you've actually gone out to the community, said from a long-term perspective, on a year-by-year or process, is that what you're actually delivering on, or are you changing your direction all the time and the community's not necessarily understanding where you're going? So so that's where it is, it is that forming that foundation, and then obviously it assists in the management of the community expectations. It is that thing about building community expectations. If the community understands the direction that we're going and we're sticking to that direction, it is a lot easier to get through some of those decision processes. It's just when we've said one thing and then we go out and do something different. So it is just making sure that we're consistent. We don't have, it's not a plan that we steadfastly have to sit there and say, this is what we said that we're going to do, but we still need to actually make sure that we continue to operate within the framework of the long-term financial plan. Again, these challenges aren't new to us, because they were put forward through the budget process, but they are these challenges that we still need to actually keep in the top of our mind as when we actually go through and analysing, to sit there and say, is the plan, I suppose, is it achievable? Have we actually set the financial target, and have we set the financial forecast, and are we being able to deliver the things that are actually reasonable, given that these are the challenges that we've got? And some of these are immediate challenges that we have to address as part of this planning process, because realistically, if we don't actually address this first one of underlying operating deficits and in our recurrent operations, if we can't turn that around, realistically, having discussions about all the strategic, wonderful projects that we actually want to do and building that value and adding that value to the community is probably not worthy of a discussion, because we're not going to have the financial capacity to actually deliver on it. So that's pretty much, I would sit there and say that's one of the priorities of this plan that we need to work out. How can we actually change, turn that position around so we can actually, but while still maintaining those services and the programs that the community have come to expect. Obviously, we've been talking a lot about the fact that from a growth council and the growth in the region and how that's actually impacting us, and what it's actually doing is putting the pressure on our existing assets and increasing the demand for new and upgraded community assets from that perspective as well. And again, that same scenario of increased growth in the town, but also the region also adds operational costs. You know, if we have more people coming to the town centre, you know, or the town centre is becoming a focal point from a tourist perspective, you know, you've got those operational costs of making sure that the amenity of the street is maintained. So you've got those increase in your sweeping, your footpath sweeping, your bin collection and all that sort of stuff. So those are the sorts of things that we actually need to make sure that we're cognisant as we're actually going through this process. Access to funds, we all know that we've actually got a high borrowing limit at this moment. We've got a high overdraft facility. So it is, how do we actually, what are the things that we actually need to do or need to consider when we're actually going through developing the plan and developing budgets each year, is how can we actually reduce the reliance on the overdraft facility. Me personally, to sit there and say debt, you know, having debt is not a bad thing. It's just been making sure that you've got that day-to-day liquidity to actually manage that debt and service that debt, and making sure that the reason why you're actually taking out the debt is for the right purpose. So you know, having $25 million debt going forward might be the right limit, you know, but it's the form of debt that we've actually got at the moment, and that's where we need to actually make sure that from an operational perspective, we've got enough cash flow that we're actually using our own cash to do it, and then our borrowings that we're actually undertaking are just for those projects that are supplementing those long-term projects.
One of the documents here. I'm just trying to find it, but one of the debt goes well above the 25 million for about 4 or 5 years. How's that sustainable? I mean, you just talked about debt for for capital, I suppose capital items or something, but it just seems to me like that's not sustainable.
And that's not sustainable because and I think that especially in the first couple of years of, I suppose, the base case of the financial plan, is because we're trying to recover from the fact that we're actually we're still building operating deficits. So that's the scenario of saying that's what we actually need to actually get down. It is because we've had operating deficits for a period of time, the cost of that takes 3 or 4 years of discipline of reducing your cost base before your debt starts coming down. So there will still be a period of where we're actually having to increase. While it's above the $25 million ceiling that council has set, again, because our revenue is actually also increasing, it's not necessarily saying it's actually beyond our total revenue, operating revenue, available revenue, but it's what we actually need to do is demonstrate to our finances that we've got the capacity to service that debt and maintain that debt and turn the position around to sit there and say that you've actually got operating surpluses and you're starting to use your own cash to actually fund those operations, and then the future borrowings is actually just for those long-term investments. So to answer your questions, if we do nothing, it's not sustainable. And that's the whole point of this discussion that we're having tonight, and the discussions and these challenges is to sit there and say there needs to be some fundamental changes that we actually need to commit to actually turn it around, because otherwise it won't be sustainable going forward. Obviously then we've talked a lot about asset management. So asset management is a critical part of this, you know, and that's some of those change in practices is to sit there and say, one of the reasons why we're probably spending a lot more on our operating expenditure is because we haven't been doing the asset renewal. So we're actually increasing our maintenance costs because our assets are actually wearing out, and they're not at the level of, or the service level that we actually want them to be. And as soon as they get below a particular service level, they actually cost a lot more to maintain. And because we haven't actually gone through that renewal, or we've had a reduced renewal budget because, you know, we've had the ASCOSA preparedness review sit there and say that with our capital spend, it's been disproportionate focus on our new infrastructure, and it's at the expense of our existing infrastructure, which has been costing us a lot to maintain. So, and that's where we actually probably over the next 4 years or so, we have to change that shift, focus on renewal. So you're reducing your operating costs. So you've actually then got your surplus in your operating budget, and then just do very minimal new for a period of time until we've actually got that turnaround. And then obviously we have to meet our community's needs and expectations. And I think that setting this plan and what we actually go out with from a long-term financial plan and the asset management plan is that first step of setting that expectations with the community, and starting to actually manage that expectations with the community. So from a financial strategy perspective, it's proposed that it actually, I suppose, gets broken up into 3 terms. Obviously the short term, what's the things that we actually need to do in the short term, and some of those discussions that we've already had through the 24-25 budget process. We have to actually reduce the cost base of our current operations, you know. So we've built savings into this financial year. The base level long-term financial forecast builds in cumulative savings. So next year we actually have to have I think it's about 5% of our cost base we have to actually identify and work out. We have to actually reduce that from our cost base, and then another probably 1 to 2% the following year. So it's that cumulative position. How we're going to do that, that's still a challenge that we actually need to work through. Yep.
Well, one of the issues we have talked about was service reviews, and we've been told that it can take up to 6 months to do service reviews if you want to do it properly. Is there any way of shortcutting that and just looking at efficiency gains at a department level, or even at an operational level?
Yeah, and that's some of the messaging that's actually already been going out to the leadership group, to sit there and say, yes, there's service reviews, and that's looking at, I suppose, the service review, is the service review, are we doing the service or not doing the service, or how do we deliver the service? And there is that discussion that's been happening to sit there and say, okay, well, realistically, because we can say, oh, okay, we're going to have a recruitment freeze, but that's actually not sustainable. So it is that messaging about, okay, well, what can we actually do from an efficiency perspective so we can actually do more in-house, so we can actually stop, I suppose, not have services contracted out. What can we actually do to actually make, I suppose, deliver more in-house, and from that efficiency perspective, and look at the things that we're doing and how we can do things differently. And all that sort of stuff. So those discussions are been happening, and at, I suppose, at the management level.
Just also, are we actually looking closely at over-servicing? Because I mean, I do look around, and I can identify from my background as a horticulturalist areas I think are over-serviced. I mean, but I can't say anything because I'm not in the operations, but I don't know where that leads us.
Yeah, over-servicing is part of that efficiency review, is to looking at what we're doing and what what can we do, or what can't we do, or what are we doing that we shouldn't be doing. So that's just all of that efficiency review. So those things are actually being looked at from at the individual level. And I know that Wendy's spending a lot of time now. Obviously, we're going through the process of, we've been without an operations manager for a while, so we've actually just gone through that recruitment process, and that's one of those, that role of looking at the operations and to sit there and say, okay, how can we actually improve things, and are we doing the things, and can we do it better? Are we over-servicing? Are we doing things just because we've been doing it? So all those discussions are being had from that perspective as well.
Yeah, just on the service reviews, the feedback when I've spoken to other council CEOs is that a lot of that is operational, and it's not something as councillors we should get involved with, because every time it has been brought to councils, they've actually ended up upping their operational levels, not decreasing it. So you're watching all the staff nod their heads. So we have to be very careful to stay out of the operational area, and we need to be smart with who we hire, and we've already had a review of the depot and everything else, and that's what the guy doing the review of the depot told me as well. So it's not just other CEOs, so yeah, operationally we have to be out of that space, because as a council we could end up doubling some of the services and things like that, and it does happen, so we do have to be really careful of that.
And so that's essentially some of those service, that short-term objectives that we probably need to look at, as to sit there and say, okay, well, it is again as to understanding what's the expectation of what we actually need to, I suppose, reduce the cost base or not increase the cost base by, because again, it might be a combination of not increasing as we actually go through the years, to sit there and say, so maybe so those savings is avoiding future costs, not stripping out existing costs, because you can do the strip out of existing costs, but normally that's a very, very short time focus, and it's normally a 12-month focus that essentially you do it for 12 months and you really tighten the screws, but it's actually not a sustainable thing, because again, it is the thing of you do a recruitment freeze, but what's not getting done that needs to be getting done, what's slipping through the cracks, that's actually then costing us more 2 years, 3 years down the track. So that's where it is. Again, it's not, there's not a magic bullet, and it's going to be a combination of service reviews and even looking at, I suppose, from an operational perspective, us looking at services and to sit there and say, and does the community still use that particular service? Because there may have been a reason that we actually provided a service 10, 15 years ago or 5 years ago, but the community's moved on. The community's different now, that we're just providing it because we've always provided it. So we do need to ask those questions, and it is that process of actually working through that system and collecting the data, because everyone, I can sit there and say, I could go around the room and everyone would actually sit there and say, well, I think we should get rid of this, I think we could make more money here, but it's your gut feel. It's your feeling of what you've seen and all that sort of stuff. We do need to actually make sure that we've got some data and got some basis for it, to make sure it is that sustainable, rather than you don't want to cut something out and then work out, oh, actually, we do need that, and then when we try and reintroduce it, costs us twice as more, where we could have just said, yes, we continued on, we just need to deliver it, we just need to tweak it some way. One of the things that we actually are doing, so we've actually, through our internal audit program, we've actually identified, obviously this is a really important piece of work for us, and so within the next couple of weeks we're actually kicking off that scoping meeting with the consultants to actually work out, to set that framework and set those measures, and making sure that we're actually collecting those data. So so it's not necessarily going to be a, yep, this is it, overnight, all of a sudden we're hunky-dory and everything's going. And I'll be honest, I know that the audit committee set us a target. I don't think that we're going to meet that target. You know, I think that was, and I understand why you need to have those audacious goals, because if you don't have an audacious goal, you just keep on, you know, treading water and going on, and that's the reason why it is an audacious goal. But I don't think that we should beat ourselves up if we don't actually achieve it, but we need to actually make sure that we get a long way, really close to making inroads to actually do that in a sustainable way going forward. And it is more of then we're actually in a better position to sit there and say, actually, we don't need to add so much more cost on. We can actually start looking at, and you're changing the mindset and the culture of the organisation to saying, oh, actually, I don't need an extra staff now. I can actually do. You build that discretionary effort within the staff and within the workplace to actually do that bit more. So the short term, I think our short term objective is to try and get us back into an operating surplus position, and making sure that that's actually a foundation, it's a strong foundation, so that is not an aberration. It is actually, we have built the base to sit there and say each year we will actually going to have a operating surplus, and we can probably potentially build on that operating surplus without actually growing rate revenue. It is that being more efficient and getting more out of your operating expenditure. Then we've got the medium-term objectives, which probably covers next council term and maybe to the end of the 10-year plan. I'm, you know, being very arbitrary in these timeframes. And that's just basically to sit there and say, okay, we're consolidating on the work that we've done to actually put ourselves back into an operating surplus position, and then we're actually positioning ourselves to actually paying down that overdraft facility. So we're actually creating some reserves for us that we can actually use to fund our operations, and when we actually have that capacity, or when we need to borrow money, we're actually borrowing for long-term projects, and we actually have the capacity to make sure that we're actually using the right, I suppose, financing vehicle that actually best suits that investment, rather than using interest-only stuff.
A while ago, we had the LGFA come in and talk to us about borrowing, and they talked about the level that we can borrow. And then if we go over that, they would scrutinise that borrowing, and they'd put caveats on what we could do. Have we forgotten about that? That we've just said have we forgotten about that? Because when I look at this, we're way above the 25 million.
No, we haven't forgotten it. But realistically, Paul, there's no way we can continue operating without actually going back and actually increasing that $25 million limit. We have to be real in the sense of where we're at now. I think that we're pretty much probably got about $1 million before we're actually from at this point in time today. So having that 25, we are going to have to go back to LGFA to sit there and say that we actually need an extra facility. There's nothing that we can do other than turn off the lights for 6 months and do nothing and not service the community for us to actually be in a position to not having to actually go back to LGFA and ask for an increase in our facilities. So, but the other thing is to sit there and say, yes, we're above that 25 million, but our net financial liabilities, yes, it's higher, you know, as long as you're, as long as our revenue and from that perspective and our cash flow and the generation of that is still within those forecasts of, yes, we're going to be having, you know, 4 and 5% rate revenue increases before excluding growth for the next couple of years. If we commit to that, there's nothing in there, and we commit to the things that we're talking about in reducing our, making savings in our expenditure and not going out and deciding tomorrow that we're going to build a new swimming centre, LGFA will provide that additional funding. They've said that, as long as that, but what they'll actually do is to sit there and say that if you want to go out, if you decide tomorrow or 12 months down the track that it's time to do the swimming centre, we'll have to actually go back to them and say, are you okay with us doing it? That's the restrictions that we actually have to do. But no, we haven't forgotten about the fact that we've got this debt limit, and I'm knowing that at some point in time, probably in the next 6 months, I'm actually will be going to LGFA and saying, actually, I need another facility. And this is our plan, and this is our commitment, and this is what we're actually going to do. And then again, and it's up to, I suppose, us together, because we're all in this together, committing to that. So if someone comes along and sits there and says, oh, actually, I know we said that we didn't want to do this, but let's go and do this, we have to actually have that commitment to sit there and say, no, we can't do it. We'd like to do it, but at the moment, the time is just not right. It's no different from what you do at home. You might want a nice, shiny new car, but, you know, actually money's tight, and so you don't do it. You either save some money, or you defer, or you decide that, oh, actually, I'm going to wait 12 months, or I'm going to wait 2 years, and I'm going to do something else to actually make sure that I've got the money, so in 12 months' time that I can do it. That's the situation that we're actually in, and that's the commitment that we need to have around the table to actually do this. Because if we don't have that commitment around the table, I don't know why we're here. And yes, and we need money to do that, and so, and that's where we're at. It's grim. It's grim, but it's the reality. It's the reality, and yes, we're going to have to increase our borrowing limit. Where that $25 million facility is going to have to increase, and that's okay, as long as we're actually making sure that we're increasing it for the right reasons, and we're committing to increasing it for that reason. Yes, Helen?
I actually don't see it as grim. I think it's absolutely necessary. I think our community expects us to be good financial managers, and if we don't do it, then we call down enormous amounts of criticism. So I actually want to see in reports, yes, you would like to do this, but we cannot financially. I actually want to see a statement that bold that reminds us as elected members that we've had this discussion, we've made these priorities, and we can't be doing it now. Because I have a slightly different point of view. I do think, and I said it a bit last night, is that the budget we go out with, and together with the long-term financial plan, is a compact we have with our community. And if we change it, it is up to us to explain to our community what and why we are changing it. And I don't think we've done enough of that, which leads people to look at our financials and go, what the? And I've had that in the last week. I've had a number of people go, it's not making any sense. And I must admit, I struggle, and I'm still getting my head around things, to say what it is we're doing and what we're trying to do. So that also leads me to the question of, do we need to go out for community engagement with our long-term financial plan?
Yes, we do. So obviously there is a consultation process that we actually have to do, but realistically, from that perspective, I think that normally when you actually go out to consultation, it is the community sits there and says, I want this, I want that, I want that. We're not in a position at this point in time to actually sit there and say, yes, you can have this, yes, you can have that, yes, you can have that. So I think that, yes, from a legislative perspective, we have to consult on it. But I think that that messaging is to sit there and say, okay, for the next 5 years, it's a very vanilla. You know, this is our strategy. This is really strong on our strategy, is that we actually need to actually make sure that we're going to be positioning ourselves for the future, so we can actually do everything that's actually on that back wall in the future. Because if we don't spend this time now doing that, I'll be honest, that's all a pipe dream. And it can't be a pipe dream, because if we don't do some of that stuff, it's actually the death of the town, you know, and I think that's the, I suppose it is that, you know, I think someone said we're on a precipice, you know, it's to sit there and say we can position ourselves to actually prosper, or we can position ourselves to...
Yeah. And to give credit, I think our community has enough financially astute people to understand that. I think we're building this fallacy that the community won't understand. They just want. No, this town is quite conservative and financially astute enough to recognise where we are and what we're trying to do. My problem with going out to consultation is that we've got an awful lot out at the moment. So we are very much reaching the... You know, we've overloaded our community in getting engagement. We've just got I think we've got 4 things out at the moment, or we've got 3 and there's one other, and now we've got a 5th one coming. So my concern is that we've had this discussion before, when we overwhelm our community with asking for their feedback.
We probably won't be in a position to actually go into feedback until probably September, October. So hopefully the bulk of that, yes, I get the fact that they'll still be getting this bit of fatigue, but I think it is probably one thing from an organisation perspective is that we probably need to make sure that at that point in time, in that October timeframe, it is realistically, this is the focus of that consultation, rather than having... you know, and again, it's sort of a bit of an oxymoron that we actually go out with a long-term financial plan that sits there and says that we're having to save and all that sort of stuff, and we're also going out and asking for some feedback on a nice new playground. Doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense, and I wouldn't be advocating to sit there and say from that consultation perspective, like some of the consultation that we're going out on the growth framework, you know, realistically that growth framework stuff is fundamental to our success and the delivery, like what we actually need to do here. But again, yes, I would be sort of sitting there saying that we're not doing any, you know, consultation on new playgrounds or anything like that from that perspective, because we probably do need to have that period of consolidation and a bit of rest to actually sit there and think about, have that time to think about, you know, is this, and then having this plan and saying, oh, okay, well, is it fitting in with a plan? You know, is it fitting in with our strategy? You know, our overall principles that we've actually come up with from an asset management perspective, and also the long-term financial plan, from our financial strategy. And also that overarching thing from a community plan as well of what we actually want to do as well.
You're right. We're sending out mixed signals, and we're setting expectations that we don't seem to understand, that we're confusing the community. You know, here's lots of bright, shiny things over the next 10 years, and at the same time, we're going to get conservative on our spending. You know, we're undermining ourselves.
Yeah. And that's where I sort of sit there and say, so that's where I'm saying that long term, you know, that short term is the rest of this term, and probably maybe even the first year of the next term, you know, really consolidating that position, and being vanilla, being bland, you know, just getting that foundation right. But again, we still have to sort of sit there and say you can't, you know, and that's, we still have to do some planning for some of the stuff that's actually on the back wall as well. We might not deliver, you know, until the back end. We might not start delivering, but we still have to plan, because we can't not do the planning, but we have to manage the community expectations in a controlled way, rather than going out and doing a whole heap of consultation on a whole heap of things that really we know today we're not in a position to deliver upon. And it's also setting those expectations within the work, within the organisation and the staff, and to sit there and say, okay, well, you know, this is what we're doing. You know, this is our position. You know, I don't really like to say we're going back to basics, but, you know, from an asset manager, from the engineering team's perspective, yeah, we are going back to renewal stuff. You know, it's not the sexy, you know, it's not the sexy stuff. But we can still do that renewal stuff, but we can actually make it inviting, you know, as well. You know, it is, we talk about, and I'll use 12th Street and Clark Road, you know, we're making it, you know, we're concentrating efforts to actually make a difference and make that visible, but essentially what we're actually just doing is renewal work with a little bit of uplift. But that actually can have a big impact on the community to sit there and say, actually, I can see what you're doing. So once we get a couple of those on the ground, it will probably be an easier, rather than doing a bit here and bit there. And then obviously the long-term objectives probably beyond the 10-year planning timeframe. And while that's actually beyond the timeframe of the plan, I still think it's important from a community's and also the councils to still have within the plan, while we might not be specifying when we're doing it or putting timeframes, you know, having those, this is beyond, you know, it's 10 years plus, and these are the other things that are actually coming. You know, it's not a discrete period, because we're not, you know, it's not a 10-year time frame and then all of a sudden you open up shop again or shut up shop. You know, we are continuing, we're a going concern, so we actually need to also continue on. So, you know, coming up to the end, you know, when we talk about the end of that 10-year time frame, and I've got a slide going up further. It's those things that we're putting in the page as to listing. These are some of the future. You know, these are our aspirational goals that we're looking for, that we're going to start planning at the end of the time frame. And that's essentially some of this stuff that we're actually doing in relation to. So if you turn around there, I think what was there, about 35 pictures, which represents 35 projects, right? And these aren't projects that hopefully none of them are a surprise to you, because, you know, I've been here for 18 months and I've heard stuff being talked about every single one of these. And that's one of the things, as to sit there and say, we have to actually come to a consensus of a priority of how we're actually going to stage this, because, again, to actually manage those community expectations, because the BMX has one expectation, the football club have another expectation. I'm sure, you know, from a business perspective, they have another expectation with regard to the town centre. You know, other people probably have, you know, businesses probably down the other end of Adelaide Road have an expectation. People up in Williston have an expectation. You know, everyone's got these expectations, and everyone is thinking that they're first in line. You know, so that's one of the critical things about having this thing about, let's be realistic about the timing and the interrelationships between these sorts of things, that we can actually make sure. And that's building that and setting that, building that community expectations from that perspective, and us managing our expectations. Because I don't necessarily think that we've managed community expectations very well, because we're always talking about something.
Just on that, will we go out and tell the community the time frame once we sort this out? We say, well, this is where it's going to be, and, you know, your oval's going to be 20 years away. I mean, that's it.
That's what the outcome I would like to have. You know, as to sit there and say, so we will have a document that has a financial forecast, and we'll have a set of series in the document, very similar to what we've actually done with the annual business plan. These are our key projects that we're actually going to do, and this is the delivery time frame. This is the anticipated delivery time frame. So that is actually managing that expectation. So that's one of the reasons why we're doing this tonight, to try and get consensus, right? And it's going to be you know, there's going to be compromise. Let's be real. there's going to be compromise around this. Not everyone's going to get what they want. Even us as staff, you know, we've got a viewpoint. We've probably got 4 different viewpoints even around the executive table as to when we think that things should actually get done and what order and all that sort of stuff. And so it is making sure that we've actually got that agreed. It's not going to be 100%. Not everyone's going to be a winner. But as long as it is that question of saying, okay, well, can we live with it and can we, I suppose, can we carriage it?
Can I just, there's 2 more points. How are we going to deal with growth? Because in my point of view, we are treating it like an expectation, and we are planning ahead for growth. And I actually think we should wait until we have real growth. There's no point, in my point, employing people with the expectation of growth. I think we have to be a little bit more timely, and when we have that growth, shortly beforehand, when we've identified a real need, that's when we bring somebody in. I just think this type of, we're going to be growing, we need more now, is setting ourselves up as an artificial thing. And the other thing, my question would be, what about the things that aren't here? And for me, where's economic growth, economic development? Absolutely nowhere there. And we've not done it well forever, and we need to get into that space. So what do we do with the missing bits between the 35 that are there?
That's a good question. And essentially this component here is essentially about the capital thing, because I think that that's one thing that we really need to bed down. And I agree, from an economic development perspective, I would sit there and say that that's a massive gap that we're actually doing. I would probably sort of sit there and say, you know, I don't think from an organisation perspective we employ before growth. You know, I think that there's this misnomer that we actually do employ before growth. I think that there is probably something that we need to probably be a bit stronger on, having that workforce planning approach. And I've had discussions with Sue and all that sort of stuff about what sort of workforce planning the organisation has done in the past. And so that is going to be one thing that, at an operational level, that is something that we're actually going to be addressing. And I think it is, again, the same scenario of going back to David's comments about, you know, is economic development an operational thing that we should actually be addressing, and knowing that we have to actually do economic development, and then how it's done and what's the delivery of is actually an operational thing, you know. And again, from my perspective, because I think economic development is just a service that we actually need to do as an organisation, and it's an operational thing. And yes, we actually need to, you know, we've got the economic strategy, but we haven't delivered on it. We have to, you know, and that's probably one of the things, and we're looking at that now internally, as to how do we actually deliver on our economic development strategy, but also how do we deliver on our, I suppose, our legislative requirements with regard to economic development that were required under the Act. So that's an area that we're looking at internally already, because we know that that's actually critical, because we know from and I talk about growth, and this is just not growth from population, but just growth and sustainability of the town, and to do the things that we need to do, we do need to increase that economic activity in the town. And so that means creating, and how do we actually create more businesses? You know, we've talked through the budget process that we have this, our weighting of our dependency is too far on residential. And if we actually want to become a thriving town, we actually need to start shifting towards and creating some of that economic, that commercial, you know, commercial and probably tourism and all that sort of stuff, and getting that money coming into the town whether it's transitional through tourism or whether it is actually just increasing the different, and it is the chicken and eggs. You need the businesses and you need the I suppose the diversity in the service offering in the town to actually attract the people to come. You know, you can't have one without the other in a sustainable manner. So I think that those some of those operational turn the recurrent operations in to actually making sure that we've actually got an operating surplus, because that's probably one of the critical things.
I'm entitled, I'm really heartened to think that you're getting back to workforce planning, because that's not only about additional staff, that's about reworking the staffing across the whole organisation. And I think that's, from my perspective, that's something I'm really interested to see the results of. You know, we've had people in roles for 10 years and the roles have probably changed, so what are we going to do about that? And while perhaps you're considering the operational things, can I put a plug in for community development? That's another area that I don't think we've done very well at all. I think it's, under-resourced. What we do very well, it's more an under-resourcing, and I will correct myself. What we do exceptionally well with very, very little. This community, because it will be growing, needs to not only have community infrastructure, it needs community development to help it remain a cohesive, caring community, and we haven't done much in that space.
And I think we concur with you from that perspective. And I suppose this is the challenge that we have, as to sit there and say, you know, there's a whole heap of things that are coming at us that we just need to make sure that we can actually be in a position to respond to in an appropriate way, rather than a knee-jerk reactionary way. And hopefully this process sort of, you know, I'll sit there and say that, you know, we'll get to the end and we'll have a plan. I think it will be, it's probably the first step. You know, and again, we probably don't, you know, we're supposed to review the plan every year, but I think that probably as we go through this probably through the rest of the council term, I think it is something that we'll probably be coming back and revisiting quite regularly, just to making sure, to tweaking it, to sit there and say, as we go through, are we getting it right? Is there anything that we need to change? Is the emphasis right as well? Especially in the first 5 years of this plan, I think we will be, because I think it's something probably not new, but it's a bit different approach to how we're doing this. I'll probably spend a bit more time on that. So obviously the questions in the short term is, you know, the fundamental, how can we actually minimise that deficit and from this year onwards and return to operating surplus? How can we reduce that overdraft facility? Because that is actually critical. We have to actually reduce that overdraft facility. We have to start having cash in the bank, which we don't have at the moment. You know, and you know, it's focusing on reducing our cost base of our current operations to asset renewal, overdraft reduction, so we can actually position ourselves to what we actually, you know, to make those leaps into the future. Again, there's a whole heap of questions that we probably just need to ask, and from the medium term, it's planning for that sustainable growth. You know, we've got ourselves back into a operating surplus position. We're starting to generate a cash from our operations. How do we actually now plan for that sustainable growth rather than having that rapid growth, making sure that it's actually managed, and we're actually doing effective asset and debt management, you know, because we can use debt effectively. And then obviously the long-term strategy is making sure that we can sustain growth, and major project delivery. And as I said, when I talk about growth, it's actually managing that continuing improvement of the organisation and building on what we've actually got, and meeting those expectations, not necessarily that responding to population growth. It's growing as a community. So I've just sort of built on this. This is what was introduced in the budget process, about trying to break it down into chunks, looking at the rest of this financial or council term, which goes up to like November 2026. And I think realistically the emphasis is on, you know, the service delivery, so the top section, you know, that recurrent operations, and the initiatives that we're doing is looking at, you know, obviously we've got a whole heap of cyclical expenses that we have to do. You know, we have a long-term local government election that we have to pay every 4 years, but it is that asset, that workforce planning, and the strategies. You know, what are those operational strategies like? You know, how do we actually make sure that we're getting our economic development and all those strategies, those day-to-day operational strategies from getting that service delivery and those efficiencies out of those strategies. And then asset renewal, including our backlog. I think we really need to sort of focus on bringing our existing infrastructure up to standard, so we can actually strip some of that maintenance cost out of our current operations. Looking at, when I talk about new infrastructure, it's that new civil infrastructure, like so the drainage that we have, addressing areas where we've got drainage issues, areas where we've got no footpaths or curbs, or you know, that basic infrastructure. And then obviously we have to sit there and think that it's that developer-led interventions, because we do have areas that are growing and with those subdivisions, and now we're actually at that point in some of those interventions that we actually now have to think about, while underlying that, looking at what we're actually going to do for the future. So we can't just not just focus on today without actually thinking about what we actually need to do to prepare for the future. So it's more planning, it's not delivery, it's just actually understanding of what we're doing, when we're doing it, and how we're actually doing it, and managing those expectations, and looking at the debt reduction. And then just going through those cycles. Again, I've used discrete cycles, but I suspect that they're not going to be discrete cycles, but it was just more for illustrative purposes. I won't go through these. We've gone through these financial goals. They are actually across on the table. So each of the goals, each of the outcomes. So these are the sorts of measures, you know, to sit there and say these are the measures that we can actually go back to sit there and say from an operational perspective, are we actually achieving our goals? So I wouldn't mind you having a look at them, you know, putting a tick if you agree with them, if you don't agree with them, if you think something's missing. So just put some feedback on the butcher's papers. So they're all on the table there. From that perspective, so they're not necessarily new. And then I suppose the next step. So obviously tonight we've got the things around here that you all do have dots. So this is where you actually have to be disciplined, right? You can't sit there and say you want everything. You can't have all the lollies in the lolly shop, people. You have to choose, all right? So there is a key, a legend up on the wall over there. So green dots are things that you think that we actually need to do, and you only get one set, Mick. No, they're yours, Renee, they're yours. You get a show as well. Everyone in the room gets a go. So green dots is basically the short term. So I think it's between the first 1 and 5 years. The blue dots, is that right, Anna? Orange. Orange is the medium term. Blue is the long term, and pinky red is you're dreaming. It's so far in the future, or we don't need to do it. Right? So you've got 3 dots. So what you can actually do is put your dots on each of the projects. And there's also space, there's post-it notes if you want to actually add comments. So if you feel like you want to add comments and additional information, feel free to add that. There's either post-it notes, there's pens there, or you can just scribble on the butcher's papers as well.
Sharon, I mean, we've got those future projects. We're not going to discuss them tonight, are they? Because I've got comments.
So you put the comments on, you put your comments on the butcher's paper against the project. Actually, before you start running off, I haven't given permission for you to go yet. So that's what we're actually doing tonight. So then there's an information session that's scheduled for the 20th of August. So obviously once all that information is coming back together, that's where I'll overlay that into the financials of the financial forecasts and come back and pull it all together. And then also what we're actually going to do that night as well is that Wendy and Richard will be working on the asset management plans. And so we'll actually come back together because they obviously all this stuff that comes up here has to be incorporated into the asset management plan as well. So it's that interrelationship of the asset management plan. So that's an information session with the view that at the September Ordinary Council meeting, the plans will come back for endorsement for community consultation to be undertaken during October. This is if everything goes really well. There might be a couple of more workshops in there, just depending on what the feel is as we actually go through the process. Then for endorsement. So at the August information session, the independent members of the audit committee will also be involved. So they will actually be involved in this process as well from that perspective. And then it will go to in November, the November Audit and Risk Committee, it will go to them for endorsement, the complete plan, come back from consultation, and then hopefully to be adopted in November. So that's the nice clean version, but there may be a few other modifications of coming in and coming back to some information sessions. So does obviously everyone in the room has got some dots, and everyone in the room, even Renee and Erin, has got the opportunity to actually put there from a priority perspective and bring back their thoughts. It is, and feel free to add comments, because it is that, and all those comments and that feedback will actually come back into that integration of and form that basis of the determination of how we actuly block things out. And hopefully there's some degree of consensus.
And the three missing elected members will be sought.
So I know that Nathan's already reached out to me. So I'm catching up with Nathan tomorrow, Tuesday. So their feedback and opportunity from that perspective as well. And then obviously when Ethan's back, I think Ethan's back the following week. So we'll catch up with those as well. Understand? So there is pens on the table over there. There should be some post-it notes if you either want to scribble on a post-it note or scribble straight onto the butcher's paper. All good? And for the community, we're stopping the stream now because it's just going to be like slow TV, watching people mill around doing aimlessly. Thank you. And feel free to ask questions as we go through. But you've only allowed your 12 dots.